Yesterday, just outside San Francisco, President Biden sat down with China's Xi Jinping for their first face-to-face meeting in a year's time. The two leaders pledged to ease tensions between the two countries, and President Biden says they made important progress with agreements to combat the fentanyl crisis and also reestablish communication between the two countries' armed forces. That's a biggie. Joining us now is former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, who served in the Trump administration. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for being here. Former paratrooper, West Point grad, in addition to being Secretary of Defense. You know this stuff.
I was going to say, so he knows his stuff.
You know your stuff.
Oh, thank you.
You need no introduction. Takeaways from this meeting, and how damaging, if you could put it in context, was this dictator comment that President Biden said off the cuff near the end of things?
Well, look, I think overall it's good that they're meeting. The world's two biggest, most powerful countries meeting is a good thing that we talk, right? And the two agreements that they're touting coming out of it is an agreement to have the militaries talk frequently, which is important. When I was Secretary of Defense, I tried to meet with my counterpart at least every 3 months to talk, keep the lines of communication open, build a rapport, if you will, so that when times got tough, you could open up that line and talk. The other one is the fentanyl agreement, which is good, right? Because fentanyl is killing 100,000 Americans a year. But Xi Jinping made that same agreement to President Obama, and he made that same agreement to President Trump.
Yeah.
Right? So I think President Biden made two statements are important. One, he did truthfully, candidly say that Xi Jinping is a dictator, which he is, right? He controls an authoritarian state. But secondly, he says, we're basically not going to trust them. We got to verify what they do because China rarely keeps a promise, keeps a commitment.
Do you think that'll put a halt on the progress that was made?
No, because China needs us right now more than we need them. Why? Because their economy is in the pits, right? They need U.S. investment. They need U.S. consumer sales. Purchase, so forth and so on. They have a real estate sector that's in crisis, and that represents 25% of their GDP. They got some social unrest going on. China is not in a good state of affairs, and Xi Jinping is rightfully concerned.
But we heard Chinese officials reacting to the dictator comments, saying it's extremely wrong and irresponsible. Doesn't that sort of, I don't want to say negate the goodwill that we made yesterday, but doesn't that put a little bit of, taint it just a little bit?
Sure, it does. That's right. But
will there be a cleanup on aisle 6 today from the White House?
You know, President Biden has been more candid than I think most people would prefer in his administration, right? He said a couple of years ago on 4 separate occasions that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense. And that's importantly as well. I think that is an issue that we haven't heard much about, right, is Taiwan. And why is that significant? That is clearly a flashpoint where we could see the United States and China get in some type of conflict. And importantly, Taiwan has important elections coming up in 2 months, in January. There's going to be a change of power, and China is watching this very closely.
Can we take a look at Israel? Were you going to go
Please
there too?
go, yeah.
I mean, President Biden said he's mildly hopeful. Mildly hopeful. I thought that was an interesting choice of words about getting the hostages out of Gaza. You know, we heard this morning that they are now prioritizing young children. We all hope that, especially after we saw this story yesterday of Mr. Han, who was here waiting for the fate of his daughter, who's 8, who turns 9 tomorrow. Can you give us some insight about what those conversations look like? Because if you give up the hostages, what leverage does Hamas have to make this deal?
Well, not surprisingly, Hamas wants to trickle them out, right? They're asking for a 3 to 5 day ceasefire in exchange for 50 women and children. And you mentioned a 10-year-old. Look, they have babies.
Yes.
They have 10 months old that they're holding as hostage, which is just despicable. So I think, you know, they're trying to get this deal. It's going to be hard, I suspect, for Tel Aviv to resist that, to get some hostages back. But that gives Hamas 3 to 5 days to regroup, to refit, to rearm, to do all those things they want to do in order to carry on the attacks, which they promised they're going to keep attacking Israel.
I have a simple and maybe dumb question. All these calls for a ceasefire, all this criticism of Israel, I don't hear in that calls for Hamas to surrender.
Yeah.
Why aren't the Arab countries lining up and saying this is an illegitimate government, it's holding its own people hostage, it's killing civilians, get them out of there?
You know, because the Arab countries are afraid of the Arab Street, which is fully behind Hamas, right? So that's a problem. I agree with you. More troubling is why isn't the UN calling for Hamas to release the hostages, to cease fire, to get out of the hospitals, get out of the schools, so forth and so on?
In the meantime, we heard Chris Wray, the FBI director, say that, you know, the chatter is very real about terrorist attacks possibly in this country because of the U.S. support for Israel. How concerned, does that resonate with you? How concerned should we be?
Sure, I think we should be concerned. We do have Hamas supporters here in the United States. You always got to be concerned about lone wolves. And we can see that this issue is tearing apart the country right now. The anti-Semitism is rampant out there, at least certainly on college campuses. And the fracas last night at the DNC in Washington, D.C.
So we should be on high alert here in this country.
I think we should be alert. I think the FBI is on it, though. That's good news.
If you were sitting in the Pentagon right now, what would your recommendation be in support of Israel? Do they have to finish the fight, completely root out Hamas?
Absolutely. But to ultimately defeat Hamas in the extent that we understand it military terms, you have to prevent their ability to reconstitute their military forces. To do that, that means you have to deal with Iran once and for all. Yeah. You have to cut off the supply of arms and money and other support. And that's the bigger issue that we're not facing. If I was sitting in the chair again, having gone through this actually with Iran, you've got to move your forces into place because at some point in time, I'm afraid this escalates and you have a showdown with Iran.
Is there a simple answer to preventing civilian casualties?
There's not. I mean, Gaza is so dense, and Hamas is not letting many of those civilians leave. I mean, I think Israel is doing the right things by opening up humanitarian corridors, urging people to leave, going as far as to provide fuel and safe exits out, but Hamas is keeping them in place, and that's a challenge. It gets back to your question, why aren't people calling for Hamas to let the people leave?
Mr. Secretary, you seem to have survived the Trump administration. There are no mugshots of you that I've seen on the news. Are you concerned?
I hope not.
Yeah.
Coming for Christmas.
Yeah, coming for Christmas. You concerned about him possibly getting back into the White House?
Oh, absolutely. I've said on several occasions he's a threat to democracy. I think what we've seen come out from him the last few months and certainly the last couple of weeks is it's going to be about retribution. It's going to be about weaponizing the institutions of our government to go after his political enemies. And it just really troubles me, it concerns me what this may mean for our great republic and our country.
Mark, we appreciate you joining us.
Thank you very much.
With your knowledge and your transparency.
Thank you, Mr.